This channel is devoted to improving public science literacy in all areas of life. I hope to provide the tools that are necessary in order to be able to assess scientific research. I'm not a scientist, so I'm not going to be attempting to explore a lot of these concepts and fields in rigorous technical detail. However, I do want to outline the steps that we ought to take in order to conform our beliefs to the very best evidence available and avoid many of the traps and mistakes that many of us fall victim to when looking at scientific research. Science and the technology that's been created through our scientific understandings has been responsible for many of the advancements in our society and culture. From transportation advancements like air flight in the early 20th century, to medical advancements like the development of semi-synthetic antibiotics to treat infections, to vaccines that have been responsible for eliminating and even eradicating disease, to more modern accomplishments like the sequencing of the human genome, which will help in our understanding of the pathophysiology of many diseases. Science continually demonstrates that it is the best method for constructing reliable models about the physical universe that we observe and for applying such understandings to our society for the betterment of everyone. First, a definition. What is meant by science literacy? The National Academy of Sciences defines it as the knowledge and understanding of scientific concepts and processes required for personal decision-making, participation in civic and cultural affairs, and economic productivity. Science literacy doesn't just entail the ability to memorize facts, but it's really a way of thinking, one in which we are skeptical, in which we demand good quality evidence to base our beliefs upon, and which we understand the methodology by which scientific knowledge advances. This doesn't mean that we need to attain expert status on any given field that we're looking into, but simply that we understand the processes by which science is done. In this sense, science literacy is not only a luxury in our increasingly complex world, but a necessity, one that directly relates to public health. Can you imagine what your life would be like if you ignored all the fruits of scientific discovery? Or if society stifled the implementations of many of these technologies that could improve all of our lives? Unfortunately, this is the predicament we sort of face in our society today. Despite the fact that many of us rely on science and technology every day, many of us don't realize that we do, or at least we don't realize the extent to which we do, and thus we consciously or unconsciously deny science or reject its methodologies. And we do so for a multitude of reasons that are psychological in nature, such as stemming from religious or political beliefs, or due to perceived conflicts of interest within certain industries. These will be recurrent themes that I will cover throughout the videos on this channel. For example, a recent survey on the fears and beliefs of Americans found a disconcerting tendency to believe in paranormal phenomena, such as believing that thoughts can metaphysically affect the physical world, or that houses and rooms are haunted by spirits. And perhaps an even more disconcerting tendency to reject scientifically verified models of reality, such as evolution by natural selection, anthropogenic or man-made climate change, or that vaccines are safe and effective. Another recent Pew poll documented the discordance that's often found between the public's opinion and scientific opinion. The lack of science literacy globally has also been documented. Of the countries surveyed here in this study, only roughly 71% of respondents said they believed the Earth went around the Sun, rather than the Sun around the Earth. Only 34% said they accepted the Big Bang theory of the origin of the universe. 47% believed that antibiotics killed viruses, as opposed to just bacteria. And only 62% believed that human beings developed from earlier species of animals. So what are the consequences of a scientifically illiterate population? Well, there are many, and throughout the videos on this channel I will attempt to discuss these. But a few examples are warranted for now. Certain religious and cultural groups oppose medical interventions that would be life-saving. For example, Jehovah's Witnesses often oppose life-saving blood transfusions as a direct consequence of their biblical interpretation of the Bible. Some indigenous populations will refuse mainstream cancer treatment and opt for traditional or alternative, unproven cancer treatments. The anti-vaccination movement has largely been responsible for the resurgence of diseases that vaccines protect against. And opponents of biotechnology retard social progress in the effort to improve the sustainability and efficiency of our agricultural practices. It is my hope to empower you with the critical thinking skills necessary to evaluate scientific claims and immunize yourself from accepting unsupported ones. I hope you find the videos in this channel useful. Thanks for watching. Hey everyone, this is the first video of a trilogy on what is known as scientific consensus. Likely the best starting point for getting to the bottom of any scientific claim or subject is to review what the scientific consensus is on it. Very simply, it is the collective position of scientists within a particular field implying general agreement, not necessarily unanimous agreement. It's something that emerges once enough data and evidence are compiled that point towards a particular model or conclusion, weighed against any contrary data. Consensus is typically established through scientists convening at conferences, through the publication process, through peer review, or sometimes through surveys. Oftentimes, position papers will be issued to communicate what the scientific consensus is to outsiders of the field, or to the general public. Sometimes, scientific consensus positions will be formalized to the extent that major academic bodies will issue official statements declaring consensus on particular issues. Such has been the case for anthropogenic or man-made climate change, the health and environmental safety of genetically modified organisms, and the theory of evolution. Other times, such consensus is not transparently or accessibly communicated to the public, and it may be difficult for the non-scientist to figure out what the consensus is or how strong it is. So why should we care about scientific consensus? Isn't this just an argument from authority? Well, yes and no. It's not an argument from authority fallacy, in the sense that one is claiming that something is true simply because most scientists believe it. But it is an argument from authority in the sense that the overwhelming evidence that has forced the consensus is the authority. A basic component of science literacy is the concept known as consilience, which is the indication of large bodies of evidence from independent sources that have converged to a particular conclusion or explanatory model. Finding such a convergence of evidence is integral to the process of science and is itself evidence for the reliability of the methods themselves. This doesn't mean there won't be deviations in findings, since scientific experiments and studies are never perfect. However, if the convergence of evidence and thus consensus is robust enough, then the evidence inconsistent with the consensus is not enough to overturn it. Misunderstanding of this concept often leads to science denialism, which is a topic I'll cover in future videos. We must give scientific consensus due respect because scientific consensus represents the collective position of the world's foremost trained experts in a given field. What better alternative do we have for a reliable, consistent metric for evaluating claims? As untrained non-experts, you and I must at least use the consensus position as a jumping-off point in figuring out the best answers to scientific questions. If we discard it as a metric, what alternative do we have available to us? Do we just appeal to whatever makes sense to each of us individually as non-experts in a sort of arbitrary manner? That simply isn't reliable if our goal is to arrive at the most reasonable explanation or answer for a given scientific issue. Of course, it is true that in practice, the scientific process cannot exactly be separated from the individuals who carry it out. But this is even more reason why consilience or consensus is needed to move it forward. Let's also be careful not to equate the scientific consensus with the public consensus, or just generally what the majority of the public believes to be true, which isn't necessarily in line with the bulk of the evidence. Public consensus is clearly not a relevant benchmark for assessing the likelihood of a scientific claim. This is not to say that we should forfeit our critical thinking skills and automatically and blindly accept the scientific consensus or what the experts say, but it is a very good starting point to thoroughly understand the currently accepted wisdom before considering more minority or fringe positions. Let's be humble and acknowledge who the leaders are in their fields, and not so casually dismiss them because some alternate view sounds convincing to us or conforms to our beliefs. To quote prominent neurologist and skeptical writer Steven Novella, "For anyone trying to take a scientific approach to knowledge about the world, we must rely heavily upon experts, or those who are more knowledgeable than we are. There is no choice. There is simply too much specialized scientific knowledge for anyone to be an expert in everything, or even a significant portion of scientific disciplines." Let's remember that the existence of a scientific consensus does not mean there will be no dissenters from within the scientific community. There almost always are, but usually they're limited and insignificant in relation to the balance of evidence. It's also important to acknowledge that there are legitimate ways to question a particular scientific consensus. Though without expertise in a field, and thus the ability to come up with the evidence to do so, it's really not going to happen. Future scientific research will continue to update our understandings, refining currently accepted wisdom and seldomly discarding it. But the time to embrace such new understandings is when we can demonstrate it, not before, and not because we can point to other models that have been overturned in the past. And that is the subject of the next video of this video trilogy: how scientific consensus changes over time. Thanks for watching. Hey everyone, this is part 2 of a video trilogy on what is known as scientific consensus. I'm going to explore a few examples of how the scientific consensus has changed over time, and also the scientific theories that they're based upon, so we can understand how they change. I'm going to focus more on modern examples, sticking to the latter half of the 20th century mostly, because science really operates differently today than it did several hundred years ago. But first, it's important to understand what scientific theories represent before we can understand how they change. Put simply, a scientific theory is an explanation or model about the physical universe that explains observed phenomena with a high degree of predictive power. In other words, it takes data we've accumulated and seeks to find the best explanation for it. An explanation that has to be tested rigorously, explains as much of the data as possible with the fewest holes, and is useful in making accurate predictions. As more data is accumulated, these theories will be refined and the explanations will become more nuanced. Or in some cases, a theory will be overturned almost completely and be replaced with another theory that has higher explanatory power. The latter doesn't happen very often. They're what physicist and philosopher of science Thomas Kuhn called paradigm shifts, in which new approaches for looking at a particular field or question are developed due to new findings that cause a considerable shift in evolution in scientific knowledge. This occurred when Einstein developed the theory of relativity that supplanted Newtonian or classical mechanics. Classical mechanics is still useful today, say for example in engineering, but relativity simply has greater explanatory power. It too will likely be updated in time, since it doesn't adequately address interactions between extremely small particles. It's what we have quantum mechanics for. time will tell what theory may be developed and accepted next. These next few examples are not so much how scientific consensus changes, but more so how they develop and replace folk wisdom or previously held medical assumptions. In 1956, British epidemiologist Alice Stewart published a study reporting on an increased incidence of childhood cancer as a result of fetal X-rays. Her findings were initially harshly criticized, including by other prominent epidemiologists, and her methods often regarded as unsound. She was essentially castigated by much of the scientific establishment, and funds were not made plentiful for her ongoing efforts. After 2 decades, other scientists were finally able to replicate her results, and Stewart's findings were vindicated, and medical X-rays during pregnancy were largely reduced. In the late 1950s, American epidemiologist Ansel Keys published the first paper of the now famous 7-country study, which was the first major study to identify high serum cholesterol as a major risk factor for coronary heart disease. This eventually became known as the lipid hypothesis, for which a consensus formed in support of by the mid-1970s after more and more lines of evidence verified the findings of this initial study. There still exists some controversy within the medical field and some unfortunate noise all over the internet about this subject, but the scientific consensus very much remains strong today. This will be a subject I explore in more detail in a future video. Until the mid-1980s, it was widely believed that stress was the primary cause of stomach ulcers.
Well, now I've got my proof. You've stewed yourself into a duodenal ulcer.
Until Australian scientists Dr. Barry Marshall and Dr. Robin Warren discovered a bacterium, Helicobacter pylori, that was present in the stomachs of patients with ulcers. The initial reception of the scientific community was that of skepticism and intense scrutiny.
Now, wait a minute, Doctor. I think that...
Steve, you wait a minute. What you think has no bearing whatever on your condition.
Yet in time, the scientists were able to demonstrate validity for their hypothesis and in turn earned the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine. It is worth emphasizing that if someone comes along and tries to challenge an accepted consensus that has considerable data to back it, then the methods should be subject to harsh skepticism, at least initially. Much of what gets published in the scientific literature is simply preliminary findings, which then have to be sorted out by the scientific community at large to see if such results have any merit. It's also worth repeating that the thinking that existed before these scientific discoveries were made did not really represent scientific consensus at the time so much as it did pre-consensus thinking. Remember, scientific consensus is when mountains of data have accumulated that converge towards a similar conclusion. So, common assumptions by scientists based on an absence of good data is not the same as a scientific consensus. Sometimes we hear the argument that because science was wrong before, we can discard the current scientific consensus, as it could be wrong. The cases of Galileo or Ignaz Semmelweis are usually brought up to draw some sort of comparison about how scientists who try to threaten the establishment have been suppressed or subverted in their attempts to update the scientific paradigm. This is often known as the Galileo Gambit, a version of the association fallacy. There are a number of responses to these rather poor comparisons. Firstly, 2 words: wrong century. Galileo was oppressed by the Catholic Church in the early 17th century for his advocacy of heliocentrism, that the Earth and other planets in our solar system revolve around the Sun, as it was considered heretical at the time. This, of course, does not happen today to scientists who posit theories that are antithetical to religious teachings, at least in the West. Semmelweis, on the other hand, was the first to posit what would later be developed into the germ theory of disease by Louis Pasteur. Semmelweis's initial findings in the mid-19th century were largely rejected by the medical community at the time, despite various publications that statistically documented the reductions of mortality from hand washing. Yet these findings conflicted with accepted wisdom of the time, partly due to a lack of understanding of a plausible mechanism at the time, but also due to incredulity and stubbornness of the scientific establishment. And the findings were largely ignored until after Semmelweis died, when Pasteur formulated the germ theory. There is no real modern comparison for this happening, but promoters of unproven science, or pseudoscience today, do like to use both of these historical examples to try to argue that modern hypotheses, often in medicine, that are not accepted by the mainstream scientific community, are simply being oppressed, and that eventually it will be inevitable to embrace their miracle cures or what have you. Often there is an attempt to paint the scientific community as dogmatic, close-minded, locked into a particular social ideology, or somehow corrupt. This is all a deflection from having to actually produce good quality evidence to support such alternative views, which inevitably would displace accepted theories if they can be substantiated, as we've seen with the examples I provided earlier. It might take time, whether due to lack of sufficient data, scrutiny from the scientific establishment, or even socio-economic pressures that cause certain institutions to oppose such scientific realities. That begs one question that I'll deal with in part 3 of this trilogy. Can the scientific consensus be corrupted? Whether bought out by political or corporate interests, or simply due to systemic pressures as part of a formal conspiracy or not. Meet me in the next video for that. Welcome back. This is part 3 of a video trilogy on what is known as scientific consensus. How prevalent is corruption in scientific consensus? And can it be so prominent as to distort the scientific consensus? These are questions I'm going to attempt to answer. Meta-research, or research about research, is something that's been studied quite a bit in the past couple of decades. Scientific misconduct, specifically, has received special attention, and there is quite a bit of empirical data on this, with relatively consistent results. Let me share some of it with you. A 2005 study in Nature found that for the main forms of scientific misconduct, fabrication, falsification, plagiarism, or data modification, roughly 2% of scientists admitted anonymously to having committed some form of it. There were higher amounts reported for other types of misconduct, though these were the less severe types. In other studies, with smaller and less widely representative samples, the admitted rates of the main forms of misconduct ranged from 1 to 7%. Perhaps most all-encompassing, a meta-analysis in 2009 on scientific misconduct found that roughly 2% of scientists admitted to having fabricated, falsified, or modified data or results at least once in their careers, but noted that this was likely a conservative estimate. Some critics have suggested that rates of misconduct are underreported. However, many studies that asked scientists about the behavior of their colleagues did not control for duplicate reporting. So a 2008 study attempted to do this and found that over a 3-year period, a rate of the equivalent of roughly 3 cases per 100 people per year was found, so around 3%. From March 2008 to March 2014, of the 113,000 records in the FDA's Inspections Classifications database search, 3.7% of them were classified as, quote, official action indicated, relating to a severe form of clinical trial violation, though there are indications that the FDA fails to disclose many of these cases to the public and to journals. And finally, a recent study tried to answer how much money scientific fraud wastes. The findings, published in the eLife Sciences journal, were as follows. Quote, "We found that papers retracted due to misconduct accounted for approximately $58 million in direct funding by the NIH between 1992 and 2012, less than 1% of the NIH budget over this period." So it seems from all the literature on this topic that scientific misconduct and corruption is certainly a real problem, but a lot less than what many people claim. It seems that a small significant percentage of research is tainted with severe forms of misconduct, and that a larger but still small minority of research is tainted with less severe forms. Another problem that can infect the scientific literature on any given topic is what is known as publication bias, which is when only a select portion of data is published for a given topic. For example, when only positive clinical trial data for a new drug being tested is published, while the negative data is withheld. This is a large problem, and I'll discuss it more in depth in a future video. Suffice it to say for now that consensus typically isn't established in immature fields where publication bias is likely to be a problem, though there have been known to be faulty approvals of drugs on occasion whose backing research was tainted with publication bias. However, using publication bias as a reason to doubt all scientific consensus positions, absent a rigorous analysis of the evidence on whether the problem exists in a field, is unjustified, and often is just done to promote doubt over all science, which is not helpful to understand the scientific literature as a whole. This is even more reason why we need to be sensitive to what the bulk of the evidence, and thus consensus, points towards. The inherent process of science is a bias mitigating one, and thus one that protects against corruption. Thus, the wider the consensus, or stronger the convergence of evidence of a particular theory, the less likely it is to be tainted by any sort of bias. I won't claim that corruption of an entire scientific consensus is outright impossible, but I think it's safe to conclude that it's hugely implausible, especially as the body of evidence grows larger and if similar results are ascertained from many different funding and research sources. Perhaps this was demonstrated best when Big Tobacco ultimately failed to distort the scientific consensus that smoking is a major risk factor for lung cancer, or when Big Oil failed to distort the scientific consensus that anthropogenic or man-made climate change is occurring. These are two of the biggest industries, and though they succeeded, at least temporarily, in sowing doubt amongst the public about these issues, the scientific evidence prevailed. This was all documented in the critically acclaimed book Merchants of Doubt by Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway, which shows how powerful campaigns were orchestrated by the right-wing political and corporate establishment to spread doubt and confusion about these scientific findings, even after there was large consensus for them. So let's stay away from outlandish claims like the scientific consensus is corrupt, which is an extraordinary claim that requires extraordinary evidence. It's extraordinary because it asserts that a vast body of evidence, and thus the scientists performing it, have all somehow been corrupted by something. How is this exactly supposed to work? By all means, let's discuss to what extent corruption or scientific misconduct affects the practice of science. But let's apportion our belief about this to the evidence available, and try not to let any of our social or ideological outlooks cause us to ignore or deny this evidence. Hostility towards scientific consensus positions, especially the outright concept of scientific consensus itself, is usually a red flag for identifying someone engaging in fallacious reasoning, or projecting some sort of ideological bias into their assessment, often invoking some form of science denialism or conspiracy theories. These are two topics on which I'll do my next series. Denialism. That's not a word that evokes pleasant thoughts, is it? Who wants to be considered a denialist? I use the word not to insult, but to describe a particular pattern of cognition or behavior. Science denialism is specifically what this video is about, and that's the tendency to reject well-established scientific theories, facts, laws, or evidence. Dr. Mark Hufnagel describes denialism as, quote, the employment of rhetorical tactics to give the appearance of argument or legitimate debate, when in actuality there is none. It's important to point out that denialism is certainly not the same thing as skepticism. Whereas denialism refers to the refusal to accept established scientific realities, skepticism is the justified position of doubt towards propositions that are not supported by evidence and the acceptance of propositions that are. It's important to keep this distinction in mind and not conflate them. Denialism is usually unconscious, meaning people are typically not aware that they are using denialist tactics. So that begs the obvious two questions. What causes denialism? And how can we recognize the use of denialist tactics? This video will explore the question of causes, and the next video will address the recognition of such tactics. If denialism is unconscious, it's because something else is intruding on people's ability to digest the relevant scientific evidence that they're dismissing or ignoring. Denialism is often used as a self-defense mechanism to protect one's core values from being undermined. It's important to humbly acknowledge that we've all been guilty of using such tactics at one point or another, some more than others, no doubt. Inevitably, we all face conflict with facts because none of us have perfect internal models of reality. One of the causes proposed in social psychology is motivated reasoning, whether stemming from religious beliefs, political ideologies, or economic leanings. Of course, denialism usually goes along with insufficient education on scientific issues, a lack of science literacy, skepticism, and logic, and a general lack of awareness about the cognitive biases that often underpin this denial. A common finding in the psychological sciences is that we tend to arrive at our beliefs first and then backpedal to find evidence to support them. This often leads to motivated reasoning, which is the tendency toward emotion-based reasoning that is divorced from evidence and reason. Once we settle on a view, we often selectively gather evidence that supports our view and disregard evidence that doesn't in order to prevent cognitive dissonance. A review of the literature in a recent meta-analysis examined the behavior we engage in surrounding feeling validated versus being correct and reaffirmed this tendency, finding that the stronger the view, the greater the tendency to select sources in a biased manner. Unless the information was very low quality, then people don't mind reading contrary views, since they can easily refute them. In quantitative terms, people were almost twice as likely to select sources that agreed with their view than disagreed. Politics is a domain in which this occurs a lot, both on the right and the left ends of the traditional political spectrum. Religious belief is also a significant contributor to motivated reasoning. Science denialism is thus common when scientific evidence is out of step with our predetermined political or religious leanings. For example, in the US, Republicans are much more likely to reject the wide scientific consensuses on the theory of evolution and human-caused climate change, though there is considerable denial among Democrats as well, especially about evolution where the gap is less. For evolution, however, religious rather than political identification is a greater predictor of the acceptance of evolution, and the religiously unaffiliated are more likely to lean left politically. Several studies have confirmed that the endorsement of free market ideologies was a high predictor of climate science denial in particular. Rejecting the science behind the safety and efficacy of vaccines, as well as the acceptance of the safety of genetically modified organisms, or GMOs, is more split. Several studies have determined that acceptance of the science here is more nuanced and not predicted well by political leanings, but better predicted by the tendency to endorse conspiracy theories. More on this contentious topic in the next video series. Other studies have corroborated the claims that similar percentages of people across the political spectrum deny the science behind vaccines and GMOs. However, more people on the far left, a proportionally small group, tend to deny GMO safety than do people on the far right. To further demonstrate this motivated reasoning, consider this study that pitched 2 fake newspaper headlines to citizens of different values to see their responses. One headline was, "Scientific panel recommends anti-pollution solution to global warming," and the other, "Scientific panel recommends nuclear solution to global warming." The results are quite telling, that those with hierarchical and individualistic tendencies, values of the political right, were more willing to accept the facts surrounding man-made climate change if the solution proposed for it was a market-based solution rather than a government one. This is helpful in determining ways to combat science denial, that we ought to strive to appeal to people's defining values in discussing information that may provoke a defensive or dismissive response. Overall, liberals tend to trust science more, whereas the last several decades has seen trust in science decline among political conservatives and those who frequently attend church. So it seems that political liberalism is not as highly correlated overall to science denial as political conservatism is. But certain fields of science provoke denialism fairly uniformly across the political spectrum, and the extremes of both ends correlate with much higher forms of denial. While denial in certain scientific fields is more easily predicted by other factors, such as specific religious beliefs, which contradict science, and the tendency towards believing conspiracy theories. Motivated reasoning often paves the way for a whole host of cognitive biases, errors in judgment about people or situations. For example, a classic 1999 study established what is now known as the Dunning-Kruger effect, corroborated in many studies since. It's the tendency for unskilled individuals to be unaware of their lack of skill and thus overestimate their abilities. It likewise often compels the incompetent into having inflated confidence about their abilities, while more skilled individuals tend to underestimate their abilities. No one is immune from this, but it's clear that the gap between self-assessment and skill is highest amongst those with the lowest ability. This is often related to inequality bias, where we tend to ignore differences in people's skill and seek to find some form of middle ground between different viewpoints expressed. We ignore or don't recognize experts and project a false sense of legitimacy amongst different views. This is of course problematic in the domain of science, where we must inevitably defer to expert consensus. As discussed in the previous video trilogy on scientific consensus, it is an extremely important benchmark because it represents the collective wisdom of experts in a field. And at some point, as non-experts, our knowledge will be deficient and we'll have to rely on expertise. These are just some of the cognitive traps we often fall victim to that provoke science denialism. In many ways, these biases are the base state for humans. We're emotional creatures by default, and scientific skepticism is something we must learn to help overcome this. How do we do this? The first step is to recognize these biases in effect. In relation to science denialism, there are many common patterns and attributes to look for in detecting it. Join me in the next video to explore the features of science denialism and how to recognize them. Hey again, everyone. This is video 2 on the topic of science denialism. Part 1 looked at the psychology of denialism and what is likely to cause it. This video will be about its features and how to recognize them. There are many tricks that people use who wish to deny scientific evidence, whether they are conscious of them or not. I'm going to go through some of them. Hopefully it will help you recognize when people use these tactics and not fall victim to them yourself. Perhaps one of the most common features of science denialism is cherry picking, also known as selection bias or anomaly hunting. If you look hard enough, you can find sources of evidence, even seemingly reputable ones, that support just about any viewpoint. This is of course not a proper application of scientific skepticism. Science is a messy process, often with many confounding variables that we aren't aware of. This often leads to results that are outside the norm, what are called outliers. Denialists, who are driven by motivated reasoning, will often latch onto these anomalous data and ignore or reject the data that fits the norm. A related trap is the selective use of experts, or the use of fake experts to serve as justification for believing what's not accepted as the mainstream scientific view. Deniers will pick whichever subject they are passionate about and often reference groups of scientists who oppose accepted wisdom in an attempt to make it seem like there is serious debate within a field. Another main feature of denialism is the tendency to deny the scientific consensus on a particular issue, either by denying that it signifies anything important or by outright denying its existence. Examples of this include this terrible Forbes article that misrepresented a study and concluded that a majority of relevant scientists doubted the existence of man-made climate change. Or this paper, put out by an anti-GMO activist group that flat out denies the large scientific consensus that GMO foods pose no greater danger than conventionally bred crops. Hostility towards or denial of existing scientific consensus is a pretty surefire sign of someone engaging in science denialism. Next up, something you'll see quite often is the use of logical fallacies or misrepresentation in order to reject accepted science and substitute it for something else. This can be done in a variety of ways. One of the most common is what's called moving the goalposts, which is when the criteria for evaluating a claim is changed after the initial criteria have already been met, in an attempt to grant the person committing this fallacy an advantage. So, for example, those who question the theory of evolution often complain that there are no transitional fossils. Once the mountain of evidence of the fossil record is showed to them, they often will switch to another objection that supposedly renders evolution false. Another fallacy that is commonly used amongst deniers is what's known as the false dichotomy or false dilemma, which is when two options are presented as the only two. It's a form of the argument from ignorance fallacy. X cannot be true, therefore Y is. For example, promoters of alternative medicine will often state that it is justified to seek alternative treatment when established, scientifically proven treatments have failed. This suggests a false dichotomy that both have their place. In actuality, since alternative medicine is by definition inherently unsubstantiated, meaning there is not enough evidence to support its usage, it's not reasonable to turn towards when scientifically accepted treatments have failed or been exhausted. I will talk about this much more in my alternative medicine series. Let's cover one more fallacy that comes up often, one that's come to be known as the Galileo Gambit. Here is the argument. Since Galileo was initially criticized for his ideas by the scientific establishment of the time, but later vindicated and acknowledged to be right, that therefore my alternative scientific idea that is ridiculed today will soon be widely accepted too. It's a fallacy because the fact that an idea is ridiculed does not necessarily correlate with its likelihood to be found out to be correct later. In fact, most scientific hypotheses are indeed wrong. Not to mention, it's really a position of astounding arrogance to think your untrained, non-expert position on a complex scientific subject is superior to the consensus in the scientific community. Another common denialist tactic is to have unreasonable demands or expectations for evidence. This usually happens because the type of evidence that the person perceives to be needed does not exist. But science is messy, and we don't always have all the pieces of evidence neatly available to us. For example, Those who believe in 9/11 conspiracy theories that posit government involvement in the terrorist attacks of that horrific day often reject the official story that describes the Pentagon being hit by Flight 77, one of the hijacked airplanes. They do this primarily because there is no clear video footage released that shows this. However, we do have countless other pieces of evidence that experts have examined to conclude that it had to be an airplane. The conspiracy theorists have an unreasonable demand for evidence. They will only accept their one desired piece of evidence and reject all the other pieces that point towards a similar conclusion. A related mistake is to deny entire categories of evidence, and to thus demand that a particular type be fulfilled, which may not exist. For example, the randomized controlled trial is typically seen as the gold standard of all study designs, since, if done right, has the most power to weed out possible biases. However, sometimes it's not possible to do this, say for ethical reasons. When it was being discovered that smoking was a major risk factor for lung cancer, it would have been unethical to subject controlled test groups to a probable carcinogen. Therefore, other, less rigorous types of studies had to be done, such as broader epidemiological studies which use data from populations of smokers in an uncontrolled manner. In this case, the data was overwhelming enough to reliably conclude that there was a link. Yet big tobacco companies used the lack of randomized controlled trials as an excuse to dismiss the causal relationship between smoking and lung cancer. More on study design in a later video series. Another common denialist tactic, one that can have powerful social and environmental consequences, is the manufacturing of doubt about a scientific finding. Big Oil spent a lot of money on campaigns to convince the public that man-made climate change wasn't real, or at least that the model was not as strong as scientists indicate. Teach the controversy, as some would say, which is a common line from creationists who wish to teach the so-called weaknesses about the theory of evolution and teach nonsensical alternatives like intelligent design. Manufacturing doubt is often done by pointing out where disagreements occur within the scientific community, by anomaly hunting, cherry-picking experts who disagree, and so forth, things we've explored already here. Confronting people's denialism is a very difficult issue. Simply responding to people's flawed positions can often provoke something known as the backfire effect, which is exactly what it sounds like. This all begs the question, how should we confront denialism? Scientists seem to think the best way is to confront the tactics people are using when engaging in denialism, rather than responding to the objections themselves. This nips in the bud the fallacious, or biased, or dishonest tactics. Many of these features of denialism can be avoided if we respect the scientific consensus, as discussed in previous episodes, and take as broad a view of the literature as possible. It is also a good idea to be familiar with the many cognitive biases humans fall victim to when assessing reality, as well as a good understanding of logical fallacies. I want to cover one more feature of denialism here before we close off, and it will segue nicely into the next video series. One of the most common denialist tactics is the tendency to posit conspiracy theories as a means to reject established science and propose an alternative explanation. Pretty much every major denialist movement today has a conspiracy theory at its core. The anti-vaccination movement claims that Big Pharma is suppressing research about the side effects of vaccines and distorts the science to claim that vaccines are effective. The anti-GMO movement claims that Monsanto and other biotech companies control the peer-reviewed literature to the extent that they have corrupted the evidence to side with their profit motives. And the 9/11 Truth movement claims that the government had a role in the terrorist events of 9/11, while they suppress any independent investigation into what really happened that day. In all cases, the proposed conspiracies are of a magnitude so great that their plausibility is extremely low, due to the number of moving parts required to pull off such a so-called grand conspiracy. Conspiracy theories and the psychology of conspiracy thinking, particularly grand conspiracy thinking, is the next topic. Follow me to the next video series for that. Thanks for watching. Hey everyone. This series is going to be all about the socially contentious topic of conspiracy theories. What are they? What makes people believe in them? And are they true? While conspiracies do occur, the trap of conspiracy thinking can be debilitating in many ways, such that we begin to spot ordinary or chance events as all part of a perfectly orchestrated conspiracy. In this first video, I want to quickly discuss some definitional issues and then dive into the published research in social psychology that examines the question of why people tend towards conspiracy thinking. So what is meant by the term conspiracy theory? Well, there are a few definitions used by different people, which are often adopted for reasons that suit a person's particular ideological narrative. A common definition is an explanatory hypothesis that alleges the organization of two or more people acting in secret to plot against the best interests of others. However, in popular culture, as well as in the social psychology literature, the term conspiracy theory has come to commonly refer to any alternative and unsubstantiated explanation of a particular event that accuses people of plotting against others. This latter definition is the definition I'll be using in this series. These features, secrecy, the involvement of two or more people acting, the goal-oriented actions that harm others, and lack of substantiation, are all necessary features of conspiracy theories. Again, to be sure, conspiracies do occur, but I'll refer to those simply as proven conspiracies, whereas the unsubstantiated explanations that contradict the bulk of the evidence will be referred to as conspiracy theories. Granted, these are not perfect labels, and they come fully charged with provoking emotional responses in people. But I don't think we can dispose of the conspiracy theory label, as it describes a very particular type of thinking. Even more pronounced and extreme are what I'll call grand conspiracy theories, which are simply conspiracy theories that posit large groups of people orchestrating very complex events that require a near impossible level of precision to pull off without anyone noticing. Except the conspiracy theorists, of course. It is these types of conspiracy theories and this type of conspiracy thinking that I want to explore here. Many, perhaps most, of the popular conspiracy theories out there are of this type of grand conspiracy magnitude. Needless to say, I hope, the grander the scale, the less likely that a conspiracy could be pulled off without error. This video will not discuss whether particular conspiracy theories are true or not, but rather discuss the social phenomenon of conspiracy thinking in terms of its features and what causes people to believe in them. So let's get into it. Conspiracy thinking is a common subset of denialist thinking, which I discussed in the previous series. There are many common features of this particular type of denialism. First, there's malign intent. Conspiracy theorists will often refer to the, quote, official explanation, alleging that the mainstream story is a lie and part of the conspiracy. The official explanation should really be called the evidence-based consensus. Next, there's the alleged hyper-competence and power of the conspirators, discounting the possibility of accidents occurring. Then there's the significance of events' details and grandiosity. Conspiracy thinking also tends to lack positive evidence and is more based on anomalies and negative evidence, which often is related to shifting the burden of proof and argument from ignorance fallacies. And lastly, conspiracy theories are often self-insulating and unfalsifiable. Everything is part of the conspiracy, is the general idea here. including the disconfirming evidence, which of course must be planted, which means there's no way the theory could ever be refuted. It's thus believed in like a dogma, one that can't be shaken in the believer's mind. So, who believes in conspiracy theories? Surveys between 2006 and 2011 on the American public found that half of the population endorses at least one conspiracy theory. Politically, extremism on both the left and the right, and belief in conspiracy theories are highly correlated. There are relatively few demographic factors that predict conspiracy theory beliefs. However, African Americans tend to believe more in conspiracy theories, and Hispanics and Caucasians less. These findings have been replicated several times. This pattern is even more pronounced when the conspiracy theory relates to a particular race. For example, there is a higher prevalence amongst African Americans to believe that there was a conspiracy surrounding MLK's death or the existence of HIV or AIDS. The likely explanation is that racial minorities have been discriminated against and have learned to distrust authorities more than usual. The single most predictive factor of whether you will endorse a conspiracy theory is if you endorse other conspiracy theories. If we review the literature on the types of personality traits associated with conspiracy thinking, we find three main traits. 1. Conspiracy beliefs in response to mild paranoia. 2. Conspiracy beliefs as an externalizing tool. And 3. Conspiracy beliefs as a result of openness to new ideas. The first of these relates to low levels of interpersonal trust and the common belief that the world is generally getting worse. The second explains the reasons for why your life isn't as good as you want it to be. So people often externalize by positing a conspiracy. A high degree of powerlessness, low self-esteem, and dissatisfaction with life all correlate with belief in conspiracy theories. And the third, the openness to new ideas and experiences, correlates highly with belief in conspiracy theories. There is also significant correlation between the belief in paranormal ideas and conspiracy theories. To summarize, belief in conspiracy theories is associated with lack of interpersonal trust, distrust in authority, cynicism, belief that the world is getting worse, a sense of powerlessness, belief that events are beyond one's control, low self-esteem, the tendency to seek out groups to blame for negative events, and the openness to new and unusual ideas. We're not sure which way the causality goes, if any. These are correlations that have been noted and replicated across many studies. As discussed in the previous series on denialism, cognitive bias is one of the main reasons why humans form false beliefs. Conspiracy theories are no exception to this. In fact, there are 4 main cognitive biases that humans fall victim to that tend to dispose them towards believing in conspiracy theories. They are illusory pattern perception, the proportionality bias, confirmation bias, and the projection bias. The first is a type 1 error. We think we've seen something meaningful rather than randomness. Type 2 error is that there is something meaningful, but we see randomness. Almost every conspiracy theory commits a type 1 error. In fact, there's an evolutionary advantage to it. The lack of control increases the likelihood to see illusory patterns and thus commit this type 1 error. The proportionality bias is that we want big important events to have big important causes. It doesn't sit right with us to think that JFK's murderer was just one guy. yet we tend not to attribute the same nefarious conspiracy theory with the unsuccessful attempted murder of former US President Reagan. Confirmation bias is one of the most common cognitive biases, which is when we seek to find information that confirms our prior beliefs and dismiss contrary information. This relates to conspiracy theories in a fairly obvious way. Those prone to conspiracy thinking will seek to validate their alternative explanations by typically only reviewing information sources that are supportive of their views, while either dismissing or ignoring contrary sources, or only reviewing contrary sources with the goal of refuting them. And the projection bias refers to the tendency to think that others have similar beliefs or attitudes as we do. This might seem surprising, but it's found to be a common bias at play amongst conspiracy theorists. There has been found to be a strong connection between those who would conspire themselves and the endorsement in conspiracy theories. They conspired because I would conspire, is the basic mentality here. All of these biases and traps in thinking will often converge to form what psychologists call a monological belief system, where conspiracies are perceived everywhere and anywhere and can explain anything. It's so dominating of an ideology that it even motivates some people to believe in contradictory conspiracy theories at the same time. This begs the question, how do we prevent conspiracy thinking? Simply educating people by providing correct information isn't enough, because people are very good at finding a way to deny evidence when there is a clash between the information and their ideologies. What has likely found to be the best measure is a preventative one. We need to inoculate people ahead of time on the traps of conspiracy thinking. A meta-analysis of inoculation techniques has confirmed the benefits of this approach, though it is not without shortcomings. However, when the damage is done, inoculation is no longer possible as a preventative measure, and instead, we need to focus on improving people's reasoning methods, getting them to understand the cognitive biases that drive this type of thinking, and proposing a more reliable alternative in terms of a skeptical approach to evaluating claims. In other words, getting them to question the metrics for how they've arrived at their beliefs is the goal. This is not easy. It's the point of this channel, after all. Now that I've gone over the features and causes of conspiracy thinking, let's look at some real-world events, both real, confirmed conspiracies and the baseless conspiracy theories themselves. Join me in the next two videos for some real-world application. Welcome to part 2 of this series on conspiracy thinking. In part 1, I discussed the psychology of conspiracy thinking. For the sake of balance, I want to explore a few real-world confirmed conspiracies. In the third and final part of this series, I want to explore many of the most popular conspiracy theories and identify many of their errors in reasoning and evidence evaluation that I discussed in the first video. This might seem like it falls outside the scope of science literacy, but the importance of scientific skepticism, the application of logic, the awareness of cognitive biases, and the evaluation of evidence are all extremely important and relevant here. So let's start with one of the most well-known and publicized real conspiracies, Watergate. The Watergate scandal occurred in the early 1970s during the Nixon administration in the US, which attempted to cover it up. In January 1972, a plan was presented to the committee in charge of re-electing President Nixon, which proposed various illegal activities including wiretapping, against the Democratic Party. A moderated version of the plan was alleged to have been approved shortly after. In May 1972, a burglary occurred at the Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate office in Washington, D.C., where phones were found to be wiretapped. A second burglary took place shortly after, in which burglars were caught attempting to steal telephone and other communication records. The Nixon administration denied any involvement. However, President Nixon subsequently blocked attempts to uncover the source of the funding of the burglaries. Soon after, evidence started to mount that implicated Republican involvement in the events, and moreover directly tied the burglars in the effort to re-elect President Nixon. This indicated the likelihood of a conspiracy. When enough evidence emerged in the way of recorded tape and telephone conversations in the White House and the admission of conspiracy by various key players, and after pressure to impeach Nixon, Nixon resigned, becoming the first and only U.S. president to do so. However, there was never any clear, incontrovertible evidence that implicated Nixon in having planned or of knowing in advance of the Watergate break-in itself. While there's no conclusively established, agreed-upon motive for the events, one primary motivation is usually cited. Nixon had inherited a mess with the Vietnam War. After a report was publicized by Daniel Ellsberg that undermined the U.S.'s legitimacy in being part of the war, the anti-war protest movement exploded. Nixon's attempts to prevent more leaks of classified information about the war ended up in the creation of his own illegal police and detective force, and the carrying out of various illegal activities. Testimony after the fact suggested that the burglars were looking for anything that could undermine the Democratic Party's efforts to take office, and that there wasn't one single motive for the event. However, other more recently released documents have indicated that the break-in was more specifically in an attempt to link Democrats to prostitution. Overall, the scandal ended up in the indictment of 69 people, 48 of which were found guilty and incarcerated, including many top officials of the Nixon administration. Another far lesser known confirmed conspiracy was Project MKUltra, a secret CIA program that began in the early 1950s. The program researched mind control through a series of horrific experiments on human subjects, with the aim to develop drugs and procedures for interrogations and torture. The program engaged in many illegal activities, such as using American and Canadian test subjects against their knowledge and consent, and administering test subjects various drugs, most notably LSD. It involved the use of hypnosis, sexual abuse, and various unfathomable forms of psychological torture. The activities were conducted in at least 80 universities and by at least 185 private researchers. MKUltra was indirectly funded by the CIA, so many of the participants were unaware of their affiliation with it. Many reports documented the horrible, lifelong disabilities that many of the test subjects were left with. In the early 1970s, the program conceded that its goals were not achievable, and the program was halted. Because of the gross ethical and legal violations that MKUltra committed, the CIA destroyed most of the documents, though a few have turned up over the years in misplaced archives, all of which have been declassified and are available for download. Despite the uncovering of many aspects of this absurd program, many conspiracy theories still exist about the program due to the destruction of most of the documents. Additionally, conspiracy theories exist alleging that the CIA is involved in more secret programs of similar nature today. But let's stick with the evidence that we do have and not make illogical leaps about one confirmed conspiracy demonstrating the existence of other unsupported conspiracy theories. On the other hand, the fact that much evidence was destroyed indicates there is the high likelihood that we haven't uncovered everything about the program. And the fact that the government would execute something so horrendously unethical itself, unfortunately, gives credence to the idea that they may do it again in the future. Some have even claimed the program still exists today. but no solid evidence as such exists. These are a couple real conspiracies. I'll cover more throughout the series as they relate to specific scientific issues, such as the attempted manipulation of scientific evidence and the misleading of public opinion by vested political and corporate interests. Conspiracies do occur and are uncovered, but just because real conspiracies have occurred doesn't mean your pet conspiracy theory has legitimacy or will be proven true in the future. The next video looks at a couple of the most popular conspiracy theories and examines many of their incoherencies, both in terms of the evidence and the logical fallacies employed by their proponents, as well as the cognitive biases that fuel them. Join me in part 3 for that. Thanks for watching. This is the final segment in this trilogy on conspiracy thinking. This video will deal with a couple of the most popular conspiracy theories with a focus on identifying the cognitive biases that fuel them and the errors in logic that underlie them. Let's start with the assassination of JFK. Polls consistently show that a sizable majority of Americans believe in a conspiracy theory surrounding this event. Whether it was a CIA or mafia operation, or some other explanation besides what is termed by conspiracy theorists as the official story. This is likely a manifestation of the proportionality bias, something I discussed in part 1 of this series. This is when events of great significance are thought to have causes that are equally significant. Lots of research confirms this subconscious tendency in humans. Numerous studies have likewise been conducted that propose 2 fake stories to test subjects. One in which a country's president was successfully assassinated, and one in which the president was the victim of an attempted assassination but survived. All of these studies corroborate the existence of the proportionality bias. People were more likely to regard the successful assassin as being part of a large conspiracy, whereas if the president survived, the assassin was more likely to be thought of as a lone gunman. This demonstrates that humans intuitively have difficulty believing that one lone gunman could be responsible for something like the assassination of JFK, despite what the evidence says from 5 US government investigations and the lack of positive evidence for any alternative explanation. The most consistent explanation for the assassination that takes into account all of the available evidence is the one where Oswald operated alone as the lone gunman. Another common claim amongst JFK conspiracy theorists, which is typical of conspiracy thinking in general, involves anomaly hunting, a form of cherry-picking where someone identifies seemingly odd features of an event and claims that this is somehow part of the covered-up conspiracy. Specifically, it was observed that a man was seen holding an open umbrella standing on the side of the road where JFK was shot, even though it was a clear day. A popular conspiracy narrative involves this man signaling to the shooter. However, this man eventually explained himself in Congress. He was engaging in an appeasement protest. In the 1950s and 60s, a right-wing tactic of criticizing leaders who were allegedly appeasing enemies was to hold an open umbrella. But without this piece of historical knowledge, one might be tempted to infer a conspiracy. Going back to the proportionality bias, this often leads people to commit a range of logical fallacies. Perhaps the most obvious is the argument from personal incredulity, where we reject an explanation simply because it is not believable to us, regardless of the evidence. It also leads us to shift the burden of proof, away from claims of conspiracy to highlighting negative evidence or the absence of evidence that we would find acceptable. This leads me to another example, related to the terrorist events of 9/11. The 9/11 truth movement as they call themselves, rejects the official government story of the events of 9/11 and offers a range of alternative explanations, ranging in plausibility and outlandishness. Let's examine some of the claims that are common amongst 9/11 conspiracy theorists. It's important to point out that not all truthers are claiming these things, but the examples I'll focus on are common amongst this community. A glaring example of the burden of proof fallacy, as well as others, is in the assessment of the Pentagon crash of that day. The most popular claim by truthers is that what hit the Pentagon was something other than an airplane, often proposing that a missile hit the Pentagon. 9/11 conspiracy theorists cite the general lack of video evidence, negative evidence, as positive evidence of some alternative explanation, dismissing all other forms of evidence that exist that point towards the accepted explanation from official investigations. Aside from the ignoring and denial of positive evidence that supports the mainstream story and this unreasonable demand for evidence, which are common features of conspiracy theories, there's the obvious problem of plausibility that plagues grand conspiracy theories like this. The narrative that many truthers put forth is completely incoherent and implausible. If a conspirator wanted to crash something into the Pentagon, what would they do? Would they hijack a plane, then not actually use it, dispose of it and all the passengers on it somehow, so that no one would find out? Fly a missile over a busy highway hoping that no one would notice, then scatter plane parts all over the lawn and have actors on site posing as eyewitnesses? The typical conspiracy theorist's response is that they're just asking questions. Jacking off, as some skeptics like to call it. Another favorite of 9/11 truthers is to reject the official explanations for why World Trade Center Towers 1 and 2 collapsed, as well as Building 7. They make numerous claims surrounding the supposed impossibility of the towers' collapses, such as, number 1, that jet fuel from airplanes would not burn hot enough to melt the steel in World Trade Center 1 and 2. Number 2, that the towers collapsed in freefall speed. 3, that the presence of molten steel was observed. And 4, that squibs were observed underneath the points of collapse that are indicative of explosions going off, and that cumulatively, the collapses are better explained by a controlled demolition. Each one of these claims, as well as the totality of their explanation, is contradicted by the bulk of the evidence, is plagued by terrible logic, and is better explained by other explanations. 1. The jet fuel didn't have to melt the steel, it just had to weaken it, which it clearly did, as can be seen from video and photo evidence of the floors sagging. 2. The towers did not collapse in free fall speed, as can be seen by video evidence of loose bits from the towers falling faster than the speed of the rest of the towers. 3. The alleged presence of molten steel could more reasonably be explained as molten aluminum, which could have been produced from the jet fuel. And 4. The squibs are more likely explained as compressed air being pushed out as the towers collapsed, and indeed compressed the empty space between each floors. There is no evidence of explosions accompanying the puffs of air, so the squibs explanation makes no sense. The collapse of the 2 World Trade Center towers is something that has been studied extensively in the peer-reviewed scientific literature. If you go through all of these studies, which are accessible in the notes below this video, you will see that there are dozens of studies in reputable, peer-reviewed journals that examine various aspects of the tower collapses, and the findings corroborate each other, leading to the conclusion that the towers indeed collapsed due to structural failure resulting from the airplane crashes. There is no actual positive evidence that any explosives were used, despite claims by truthers that rely on an unreputable paper published in a dubious journal that was the victim of a sting operation, which has failed to make any impact in the scientific community. There's also a plausibility problem, once again. If you were a conspirator Aiming to blow up the World Trade Center towers? Would you hijack airplanes, fly them into buildings to create a diversion as to where the collapses were initiated, while beforehand having to secretly arrange for the buildings to be wired with explosives, a process that typically takes a month or two, with the goal of triggering explosives at the exact point in which the airplane crashed into the building? Ignorant to the existence of this peer-reviewed evidence, or simply in denial of it, 9/11 truthers will often cite that there is a consensus that supports the rejection of the official story, endorsed by groups like architects and engineers for 9/11 truth. This is one of the denialist tactics I discussed in a previous video, denial of the actual scientific consensus that reflects the preponderance of evidence in the peer-reviewed literature, and the claim of a false scientific consensus by a fringe minority group. In fact, architects and engineers for 9/11 truth does not do what scientists do when they think they have a superior explanation for a phenomenon and want to advance it. That is, they are not writing papers and getting them published in reputable journals and trying to convince the relevant scientific community of experts that their explanations are superior. This is a similar tactic to that exhibited by creationists, climate change deniers, the anti-GMO community, and so forth. They give talks to the public, engage in lobbying, and just generally try to advance their ideas in any way but the academic arena. A common related claim you will hear by proponents of various conspiracy theories is that any scientist who attempts to do this in the academic world is repressed by the establishment, often suggesting that the scientific community or government fights against anyone who goes against mainstream sensibilities. Aside from not being able to prove this extraordinary claim, there are countless historical examples where scientists have overturned now obsolete ideas, many of whom received a Nobel Prize for their work. I already discussed a few examples in video 2.2. These are just some examples of the types of problems that occur when one falls victim to conspiracy thinking. There's the tendency to display the Dunning-Kruger effect in full form, where people substitute their own research skills and the explanations that they like for the consensus of experts. Conspiracy theorists engage in anomaly hunting and propose negative evidence to substitute for a more coherent narrative that better explains the data. And of course, there is motivated reasoning driven to the extreme, where not only will people deny mountains of scientific evidence agreed upon by the majority of experts, but will propose an unfalsifiable explanation of conspiracy to justify their denialism. Due to the cognitive biases that humans naturally fall victim to, you could say that the tendency towards conspiracy thinking is in all of us. All the more reason to develop scientific skepticism and a strong scientific literacy to help us overcome this baggage we all have. I hope this series on conspiracy thinking has been helpful for that. Thanks very much for watching. Intellectual honesty is vital if we want to avoid being fooled and believing things that are not true. It is likewise paramount to engaging in productive dialogue with those we disagree with. What is meant by intellectual honesty? A general definition might be an attitude towards problem solving and evaluating information that fairly deals with conflicting information in a way that minimizes the chance of bias. In the context of assessing scientific claims and evaluating competing explanations or facts about reality, there are a number of ways we can demonstrate intellectual honesty so as to maximize our chances of arriving at the most accurate perspectives about reality. I want to cover just a few that are central to a scientific worldview and skeptical approach to assessing claims. Before I do, let's keep in mind that most people throughout history were wrong about most everything they believed about the natural world. Yet, they were confident that most of their beliefs were true. In fact, it does appear that, to quote philosopher Derek Parfit, knowing and falsely believing are not different experiences. Moreover, most of us would admit that not all of our beliefs are true. Yet, paradoxically, when pressed on any particular one of our beliefs, we're pretty confident about it. Therefore, we need to implement some corrective mechanisms so that we don't fall down a cognitive black hole of confirmation bias. We need some heuristics or rules of thumb to live by in order to adequately entertain our own fallibility. First, if you actually want to understand a claim, you will go out of your way to interpret the claim in the most positive light that is plausible. This is called the principle of charity. If someone claims that genetically modified foods are safe to eat, our default assumption should be to assume that they actually think that, rather than that they're a paid corporate shill. Conversely, when dealing with those who reject established science, we can show respect for them as individuals by accepting they believe what they say and going from there, rather than assuming something derogatory about their intelligence. Closely related to the principle of charity is the value in steel-manning someone's different view. Whereas a straw man is a misrepresentation of someone's actual argument, to steel-man someone's argument means to represent the argument in a way that its proponent would agree with. That way, you are addressing the strongest version of a counter-argument or counter-claim, and thus optimally positioned to make progress. To quote John Stuart Mill, "He who knows only his own side of the case knows little of that. His reasons may be good, and no one may have been able to refute them. But if he is equally unable to refute the reasons on the opposite side, if he does not so much as know what they are, he has no ground for preferring either opinion." This is something that all sides of an issue need to practice in order to be intellectually honest and thus to be able to successfully communicate. One of the cornerstones of the scientific process is falsifiability, the possibility that a hypothesis or theory can be proven false. If you cannot state the conditions under which any of your beliefs or claims about reality could be shown to be false, then you have no way of determining the validity of those beliefs. In other words, if we can't test a claim, we have no basis for accepting it. Thus, one of the best ways to ensure we have accurate beliefs about the world is to attempt to falsify our own beliefs. If they withstand careful scrutiny, that is, if we fail to falsify them, we can tentatively accept them. This is difficult to do because we all have an interest in many of the things we believe, and confirmation bias works in the direction of rejecting those ideas that contradict the ones we hold. In order to be able to falsify our beliefs, we absolutely must respect expertise. Most of us unthinkingly do so in our everyday lives. In general, we trust that the bridge we're driving over has been constructed to adequate engineering standards. We trust that when we need a tooth pulled, a dentist will be able to perform the procedure. We trust that a plumber will be able to fix a pipe leak. However, when it comes to certain scientific issues that our individual and group identities depend on, motivated reasoning kicks in, and we often reject experts so that we can maintain our unsubstantiated beliefs. This is in play when we reject the scientific consensus on the safety and efficacy of vaccines, for example, and substitute our own non-expert opinions that are often merely informed from a few hours of Google searching or our personal experiences without the required technical training in the field. And lastly, respecting expertise means being aware of what the weight of evidence published in peer-reviewed academic journals points to. It's easy to find experts with quirky opinions on just about any issue. Most relevant is the consensus of such experts who actively engage in and publish research in a field. If we are to remain intellectually humble, we will default to this weight of evidence as a general rule of thumb. Before we close out this series on evaluating evidence, I will summarize some of the key differentiators between science and pseudoscience. Join me in the next video for that.